Pay the rent by January, or get out of my house!" my son shouted on Christmas Eve, right there between the glazed ham and the candlelight centerpiece I had spent all afternoon arranging. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply folded my linen napkin, placed it beside my untouched plate, and stood up from the dining table I had once saved for 6 months to buy. The next morning, I went to the bank. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because I never imagined the most painful betrayal of my 68 years would come not from strangers, but from the boy I raised." Christmas had always been sacred to me. Even after my husband Walter passed 3 years ago, I kept every tradition alive. The same hand-knit stockings over the fireplace. The same gold star Walter used to place on top of the tree. The same cherry pie recipe my son Brian begged for when he was little. That night, snow pressed softly against the windows of my Ohio home. The house glowed in warm white lights, and for a few fragile hours, I let myself believe nothing had changed. Brian sat at the head of the table now, beside his wife, Melissa. She wore a tight smile and a sweater so expensive it probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Their 2 children laughed in the living room, unaware that their grandmother's world was about to crack wide open. Dinner had barely begun when Melissa set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "So," she said sweetly, "have you thought more about contributing monthly?" I blinked. "Contributing?" Brian sighed heavily, like I was a burden he was tired of carrying. "Mom," he snapped, "you live here. Food, utilities, property taxes, they aren't free. Dad's gone. It's time you start paying rent, or get out." The room went silent. Even the grandchildren stopped laughing. I stood there for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the back of my chair, as if the polished oak could somehow steady the trembling I refused to show. For 42 years, this house had been my home. Walter and I had bought it when Brian was 6, back when every extra dollar went toward mortgage payments instead of vacations. I still remembered clipping coupons at the kitchen counter while Walter worked double shifts at the steel plant. We skipped anniversaries, postponed repairs, and sacrificed every luxury so our son could grow up safe in a neighborhood with good schools and warm Christmas mornings. And now that same little boy looked at me like I was some overdue bill. Melissa didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. She just reached for her wine, her manicured nails gleaming in the candlelight, as though discussing rent with a widow on Christmas Eve was perfectly reasonable. "You have the master bedroom," she added with a shrug. "And utilities have gone up." Utilities. I nearly smiled at that. Because 3 months earlier, when Brian lost money in one of his business opportunities, it was my savings that kept the lights on. My retirement check had quietly covered their overdue electric bill, their water, even part of little Sophie's private school tuition. But somehow, none of that seemed to matter now. I looked toward the fireplace where Walter's stocking still hung beside mine. For the first time since his death, the house didn't feel empty. It felt occupied by strangers. "I see," I said softly. That was all. No shouting. No tears. Just 2 small words. Then I walked upstairs to the bedroom Walter and I had shared, closed the door gently, and sat on the edge of the bed beneath the framed wedding photo they'd never bothered to take down. Downstairs, I could still hear dishes clinking. Melissa laughing quietly. As if I were already gone. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in Walter's old reading chair by the bedroom window, wrapped in the blue quilt my mother had sewn decades ago, and watched snow gather softly across the front lawn. Everything looked peaceful outside. Inside, something had shifted. Around 2 a.m., I opened the small cedar chest at the back of my closet, the one Walter always called our just in case box. Inside were 38 years of our real life. Mortgage statements, insurance papers, tax records, bank documents, the original deed. My fingers trembled, not from fear. From memory. Walter had always handled the legal paperwork, but he was meticulous. Every folder labeled in his neat block handwriting. Every important document protected. And there it was. The deed to this house. I adjusted my glasses and read it once. Then twice. Then a third time, slower. My name. Not Brian's. Not Melissa's. Mine, and Walter's living trust. I stared at that paper until sunrise painted pale gold across the bedroom carpet. Downstairs, I could hear cabinet doors opening. Melissa starting coffee. Brian laughing like nothing had happened. Like his words hadn't carved through me. But something inside me had gone strangely calm. Because suddenly, their demand made sense. The pressure. The talk about contributing. Melissa asking about bills. Brian insisting I should simplify my finances after Walter passed. They weren't asking me to help. They were testing how much control I still had. I opened another folder. Property taxes, paid through the year. Home insurance, active. No overdue mortgage. This house was fully paid off. Had been for 11 years. A slow, cold realization settled over me. My son hadn't threatened to throw me out because I was a burden. He'd done it because he was counting on me not knowing the truth. For the first time that Christmas, I smiled. Not because I was happy. Because Walter, even from the grave, had left me exactly what I needed. Protection. By 7:30 that Christmas morning, I was dressed before anyone else. Not in silk pajamas or the fuzzy robe Melissa had given me the year before like some polite seasonal obligation. No. I wore navy slacks, a cream sweater, pearl earrings Walter bought me on our 30th anniversary, and the long camel coat he used to say made me look like a woman no storm could bend. For once, I believed him. When I came downstairs, Brian was pouring coffee, scrolling through his phone. Melissa was arranging cinnamon rolls on a platter, acting every bit the perfect hostess. Neither of them noticed the manila folder in my hand. Morning, Brian muttered. Not Mom. Just morning. I poured myself coffee, sat at the same table where he had tried to reduce me to a tenant, and quietly placed the folder beside my plate. Melissa's eyes flickered toward it first. What's that? I took a slow sip. Before answering. Your Christmas lesson. Brian frowned. I opened the folder carefully, smoothing the deed across the tablecloth like Walter used to smooth blueprints. This house, I said calmly, was paid off 11 years ago. Silence. Brian blinked. Melissa's smile disappeared. I tapped the line with my name. Your father made sure of something before he died, that no one, not banks, not strangers, not even family, could remove me from my own home. Brian's face changed then. Not anger. Panic. Mom, that's not what I meant. No, I said softly. It's exactly what you meant. Upstairs, the grandchildren were laughing, tearing into stockings. Downstairs, the truth sat naked on the table between us. Melissa leaned forward, her voice suddenly sweeter. We were only talking about shared expenses. I raised one hand. For the first time in years, she stopped talking. You asked me to pay rent, I said. In a house I bought. With a man I'd buried. While eating my Christmas dinner. Brian stared down at the deed like it had personally betrayed him. But I wasn't finished. Because tucked behind that deed was another document Walter had prepared. And this one was about to change everything. With steady hands I unfolded the second document Walter had hidden behind the deed. Equals mute Han, cinematic Han. Brian's hands actually shook when I slid the second paper from the folder. I recognized that look. It was the same look he had at 16 when I caught him lying about wrecking Walter's truck. Only this time, he wasn't a boy facing consequences. He was a grown man realizing he had misunderstood the woman sitting across from him. What is that? He asked, though his voice had already lost its edge. I laid the document flat. Walter's trust. Signed. Notarized. Ironclad. Melissa leaned in first, her perfume sharp and expensive, but I noticed how her confidence had started cracking around the edges. I read aloud slowly, the way Walter always read important things. In the event of my death, my wife, Eleanor Whitmore, retains sole lifetime residential rights, full financial authority over the property, and exclusive discretion over all future occupancy. Melissa went pale. Brian looked confused. So I simplified it for him. That means, I said, folding my hands, I decide who lives here. No one spoke. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked. Somewhere upstairs, little Sophie squealed over a dollhouse. But at that table, Christmas was over. Brian rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, you know we didn't mean stop, I said. And he did. Because mothers know when their children are lying, even when those children are nearly 50. I reached into my sweater pocket and placed a small brass key on the table. Walter's private desk drawer key. The one Brian had never asked about. Inside that drawer were every cancelled check, every utility payment, every record of the money I had quietly poured into this household after Walter died. Including the $38,000 I had given Brian last spring when his investment deal collapsed. You wanted rent, I said, my voice calm enough to cut glass. Perhaps we should first discuss debt. Melissa's chair scraped slightly backward. Brian looked like the floor beneath him had shifted. For the first time since Walter's funeral, my son understood something. I was not the weak, grieving widow they had imagined. I was the woman who still held every receipt. I stood, picked up my coffee, and walked to Walter's old desk in the corner of the den. Not one of them followed at first. I suppose they thought I was being dramatic. But grief teaches you something age never could. When people underestimate your silence, let them. I unlocked the bottom drawer with the brass key and removed a thick leather ledger Walter had kept for decades. He believed in paper trails. Memory fades, he used to say. Ink doesn't. I carried it back to the kitchen table and opened it beside the cinnamon rolls no one was touching now. Page after page. Dates. Amounts. Signatures. Brian's college tuition. The down payment Walter and I gave him for his first condo. The $12,000 loan for Melissa's boutique idea that quietly disappeared within a year. Then the larger one. $38,000. Transferred 14 months ago to save Brian from bankruptcy after he begged me not to tell Melissa how bad things had gotten. His face drained so quickly I thought he might faint. Mom, he whispered. No, I said. You don't get to mom me now. Melissa turned toward him so sharply her chair legs scraped hardwood. Bankruptcy? He couldn't even meet her eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I covered your mortgage for 4 months, I said, sliding the bank statements forward. I paid your utilities. I protected your children's school tuition. And yesterday, you demanded rent. The room felt smaller. Melissa's polished image cracked first. You told me your mother barely helped, she said to Brian, her voice tight with disbelief. I almost pitied him then. Almost. But pity is expensive, and I had already spent enough on my son. I closed the ledger gently. So here are our options, I said. You can apologize, sincerely. Or by New Year's, you and your wife can start looking for a home of your own. Brian stared at me like he was finally seeing not just his mother, but the woman who had built everything beneath his feet. You could have heard the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. That's how quiet it became. Brian sat there, shoulders slumped, staring at 30 years of receipts like they were a language he never bothered to learn. Melissa, however. Melissa was different. Some women crumble when the truth arrives. Others calculate. She folded her hands slowly, her voice suddenly honey-soft. Eleanor, she said, I think maybe we all just got emotional. It's Christmas. Brian didn't mean it the way it sounded. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman had lived under my roof for 8 years. I had babysat her children when she wanted spa weekends. I had cooked Thanksgiving dinners while she posted filtered family photos online with captions about gratitude. I had even defended her when neighbors whispered she cared more about appearances than people. And still, she thought I was foolish enough to miss what she was doing now. Repositioning. Not apologizing. I turned to Brian. Did you mean it? He opened his mouth, then closed it. That told me everything. Because real remorse doesn't hesitate. I asked a simple question, I said. He swallowed hard. We've been under pressure, Mom. Pressure. Such a fragile little word for cruelty. Pressure, I repeated. Was what your father and I felt when we skipped meals so you could have braces. Mather spoke. Pressure was Walter working Christmas Eve in a snowstorm so you'd wake up to that red bicycle. Brian's eyes dropped. Pressure, I said quietly, is not throwing your widowed mother out of her own home. Melissa finally lost her polished calm. Well, maybe if everything wasn't always about the past. No, I said. Just one word. But it landed like a locked door. This house exists because of the past, I said. Every wall. Every gift under that tree. Every comfort you've mistaken for entitlement. Then I reached over and took back the spare house key Melissa had kept on her designer keychain since moving in. Not dramatically. Just firmly. Until respect returns, I said, access changes. And for the first time since she married my son. Melissa looked afraid. The rest of Christmas Day unfolded like fragile glass. No one mentioned rent again. Brian disappeared into the garage for nearly an hour, pretending to organize tools that Walter had once kept immaculate. Melissa stayed unusually quiet, her tight smile gone, her social media perfect charm replaced by clipped whispers and stiff shoulders. But I noticed something important. For the first time, they were uncomfortable. Not me. I spent that afternoon in my sunroom, the one Walter built for me after my 60th birthday because he said I deserved a place where light could always find me. I sat beneath the winter sun with a cup of tea, reviewing every document in that ledger. And what I found made my stomach turn colder than the December wind. Over the past 2 years, Brian had not only borrowed money. He had been slowly positioning himself. Mail from the property tax office had been redirected once. A refinancing advertisement had been marked up in his handwriting. I found brochures about estate transfers, refinancing packets, and notes Brian had scribbled after meeting with a financial advisor elderly parent. Not mother. Not Eleanor. Just an obstacle with assets. I stared at those words until the page blurred. Then, strangely, I stopped. Feeling hurt. Hurt requires hope. And hope had quietly died sometime between pay rent and elderly parent property. By evening, the Christmas lights on the tree blinked softly while snow thickened outside. Melissa finally approached me, her tone careful. We should all start fresh, she said. For the kids. I looked at her over the rim of my teacup. No, I said gently. For the kids, this ends now. Because children learn what family means by watching adults. And I would not let my grandchildren grow up believing love was something you used until paperwork got in the way. That night, after everyone went to bed, I called Walter's attorney. Walter's attorney, George Holloway, answered on the third ring. He was 72, sharp as winter air, and one of the few men Walter trusted without question. When I quietly explained everything, George didn't sound surprised. That hurt more than I expected. Eleanor, he said carefully. Walter added a protective clause to the trust 6 months before he passed. I gripped the phone tighter. A clause? Yes. If any resident of the property attempts coercion, manipulation, or unlawful pressure regarding ownership or financial control, you have the legal authority to revoke long-term occupancy privileges. I said nothing for a moment. Not because I was shocked. Because Walter had known. Somewhere, before cancer took him, my husband had seen enough to prepare for a day I prayed would never come. George's voice softened. He loved you, Eleanor. He wanted to make sure kindness was never mistaken for weakness. I closed my eyes then. Not from sadness. From the unbearable comfort of being protected by a man who was gone, and still shielding me. The next morning, December 26th, George arrived at 10 sharp carrying a leather briefcase and a calm expression that immediately drained the color from Brian's face. Melissa nearly dropped her coffee. Why is there a lawyer here? She asked. I folded my hands. Because Christmas is over. We sat at the dining room table again. Same chairs. Same chandelier. Different power. George reviewed the trust, the financial records, and Brian's documented attempts to interfere. No shouting. No accusations. Just facts. Clean. Precise. Devastating. Then George placed a formal notice on the table. Under the Whitmore Trust, he said evenly, Mrs. Whitmore is exercising her right to restructure residential terms effective immediately. Brian blinked. Restructure? I looked directly at my son. You and Melissa will have 90 days to move. Melissa gasped like I'd struck her. Brian looked shattered. But I had learned something by then. When mercy is treated like permission, boundaries become necessary. And for the first time in decades, I was no longer protecting my son from consequences. Brian didn't speak for nearly a full minute. He just sat there, staring at the notice like words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. 90 days. Not a threat. Not emotion. Law. Melissa recovered first, of course. She always did. This is insane, she snapped, standing so quickly her chair nearly tipped backward. We're family. George didn't even blink. Family, he said calmly, typically does not attempt to pressure a widow out of her legal residence. I almost smiled. Melissa turned to Brian, expecting him to defend her. But my son, my once loud, commanding son, looked tired. Not angry. Exposed. Mom, he said, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. Please don't do this. And there it was. Not. I'm sorry. Not. I was wrong. Just don't make me face consequences. I looked at him carefully. For one dangerous second, I saw the little boy with scraped knees who used to run to me after school. But memory can be a trap. Because love without respect becomes permission for betrayal. I'm not doing this to you, I said quietly. I'm responding to what you already did. The truth landed harder than any scream. Upstairs, Sophie called down asking if Grandma wanted to see her new doll stroller. I swallowed the ache in my throat. Coming, sweetheart, I called gently. Then I stood. Your children are innocent, I told Brian. So I will help them transition. I will never punish them for their parents' choices. Melissa's expression shifted then. She had expected revenge. Instead, I offered boundaries. And boundaries are much harder to villainize. George gathered his papers. Before leaving, he handed me one final recommendation. Change the estate access codes. Update beneficiary reviews. Protect your peace. Protect your peace. Such simple words. But after years of confusing sacrifice with love, they felt revolutionary. That afternoon, while Brian sat in silence and Melissa furiously searched rental listings, I took my grandchildren upstairs, helped assemble a dollhouse, and realized something extraordinary. For the first time since Walter died, I wasn't surviving in my own home. I was reclaiming it. The next 3 months changed everything. Not because Brian and Melissa suddenly became better people, but because, for the first time, I stopped making their comfort my responsibility. They moved differently after that. Quieter. Careful. Melissa no longer criticized how I folded laundry or suggested I downsize my Christmas decorations. Brian stopped making casual comments about bills, groceries, or shared responsibility. It was amazing how respectful people become when legal paperwork replaces assumptions. I remained kind. But kindness, I learned, is most powerful when it has a spine. I helped my grandchildren through every change. I made sure Sophie still had hot cocoa after school, and I never missed Jacob's Saturday basketball games. Because children should never carry the weight of adult greed. But their parents? That was different. Brian tried, once, to ask if I would reconsider. We were standing in the garage, surrounded by boxes marked kitchen and master bedroom, while snowmelt dripped slowly outside. "Mom, maybe we can work something out." I looked at him, not cruelly, not coldly, just clearly. "We already did," I said. 90 days. He nodded like a man finally understanding that access to someone's love does not equal ownership of their life. By March, they were gone. Not homeless. Not abandoned. Just relocated, into a townhome they could actually afford without manipulating a widow. And when the moving truck pulled away, I stood on my front porch beneath Walter's old brass lantern and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Space. Real space. I turned Brian's former bedroom into a reading room. Melissa's home office became my sewing studio. And the master bedroom? It stayed exactly as Walter and I designed it. Because some things do not need replacing. On the first Sunday after they left, I sat alone at my kitchen table, morning sunlight spilling across freshly polished wood, and realized silence had changed. It was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. And peace, after betrayal, is the most expensive gift you can give yourself. The following Christmas, snow fell just as softly as it had the year before. But this time, the house felt different. Not quieter. Holier. The tree still stood in the same corner by the bay window, glowing gold against the Ohio winter dusk. Walter's star still rested proudly on top. The stockings were hung again, mine, Sophie's, Jacob's, and yes, even Brian's. Because forgiveness, I discovered, does not always mean restoring what was broken. Sometimes, it simply means refusing to become bitter. Brian came that afternoon alone. No demands. No assumptions. Just a pie from the bakery downtown, and shoulders that looked older than 48. When I opened the door, he didn't rush inside. He just stood there in the cold, holding that pie like a peace offering too fragile to survive rejection. "Mom," he said quietly, "I was wrong." Not pressured. Not rehearsed. Real. And for the first time in a very long time, I believed him. Healing didn't happen in one hug or one apology. Some wounds deserve time. But over cinnamon coffee at my kitchen table, the same table where he once told me to pay rent or get out, my son finally listened as I spoke, not as his safety net, not as his property, but as a woman. As his mother. Melissa came later, slower to change, but change, nonetheless. Boundaries remained. So did wisdom. Because love rebuilt without respect will always collapse again. Now, every Christmas Eve, before the grandchildren open presents, I tell them the same thing. This house was built with sacrifice. It stands because of love. And love without gratitude is just taking. They probably won't understand that fully until they're older. But one day they will get out. He thought he was giving me an ultimatum. What he really gave me was my awakening. Because I was never the burden. I was never the tenant. I was the foundation. And from that day forward, no one in my family ever forgot it.